basically she's the only child in her, comes from a very poor family. Her parents have gotten on in age, so they're no longer able to farm the rice paddies. So basically she came to Malaysia to work as a domestic worker, and let me just make this more concise. She was here for 2 years, and for 1.5 years it was okay, and then the last 6 months involved things like working 19-hour days. Her wages were completely suspended. She had never been paid. Tearing of her clothes, having to live outside next to the doghouse. So basically, Tenaga Vita took on this case, and they negotiated. And in the end, she got 33,600 ringgit, which amounted to 2 years of unpaid wages, plus 3 years of wages on top of that. And the Cambodian embassy said that that was fine. My group hypothesized that they were being very diplomatic and being good at, I guess, what embassies do. They said that was fine because with that money, she would be able to buy a substantial plot of land, make her own rice paddies, and have a little money extra for when she got married. And the people who did this to her paid for her flight ticket back. So my group went over what were the problems faced by, what is this? Migrant workers, sorry. Okay, wow. That's on a big learning curve. Okay, so obviously the most salient thing is the physical abuse. When she came to Tenaga, there were bruises, her eyes were bloodshot. So physical abuse was probably the biggest problem, but it was clear that we have many people on our table, lawyers, I'm a psychologist, NGO workers. There were many perspectives and angles from which to look at it. Passport was withheld, and obviously there's some people who will toe that line that the passport's being withheld so we can process the documentation, but that's illegal. So unlawful detention, she was hardly fed, starvation, long working hours, false imprisonment, and the rest is, you can read, was not allowed to contact her family. That's actually a good thing, I didn't mention that, for the whole 2 years that she was there. So what we talked about in the group was, if you're coming at it from Tenaga Vita, that they actually did a great job. Like, their resolution was very practical and short term. They got the money, and that's very, very important. But one of the questions was the resolution just, and why? So our group decided that it was a very good, positive start, but there are many more things that need to be, that can be done. So some of the obstacles and challenges faced is, while there wasn't a court case, and I'll get to that, but who bears the cost? When you're negotiating the salary, or even if you take it to court, where does the maid go? That's obviously borne by the NGO, so cost is a problem. A lot of people in a roundtable discussion, an interesting point was made, why would people not take it to the police or the government? And I guess a perception is, you only go to the police if you're a criminal. You're sort of loath to report it as a concerned neighbor. You probably think the system's too big, there's bureaucracy. And sometimes, this was another interesting discussion, sometimes the victim is unwilling. Like, their solution is, I got my money, I've been abused, I want to go home. And what was interesting is, our discussion, one point of view was, we don't want to put your own personal opinion upon the victim, right? You think maybe they should file charges, so on and so forth. Maybe they don't want to. Your job is to give people solutions. But let me get her name right, Latifa, who's had to leave, she pointed out that whether the victim wants to press charges or not is actually irrespective, because you can't rescind a police report, a crime has been committed, and she made the example of what about if the victim was dead? Then what happens? These people will still keep employing and perpetuating a cycle. So whether the victim's willing or not, it's a long process, but it needs to be done. But that's an obstacle. The reliance on the enforcement office, so there's obviously a big gap between theory, what we can do, what we should do, and the actual application doesn't happen. Of course, the time that it takes. And then again, it was stressed the lack of evidence, and like mentioned in the panel talk, it's very important to get all the evidence that you can the first time around, because again, we had some actual case studies that were discussed. If the maid or whoever has committed the crime, pays off people, then you kind of have this amnesia all of a sudden. So it's very important to collect evidence, both for short-term and long-term goals. Long-term goals being systemic change and changing the culture and evidence of all these things happening. So like I said, we think that it's a good first step, but things that we would do would be right away to file a police report, file a report with immigration, and the reason for that is have those employers blacklisted. They try to employ somebody else in the future, it's not going to happen. We also were kind of thinking outside the box and talking about reporting the people who are doing this to their domestic staff, to their employers, because for example, if you're an employer and you employed someone who's guilty of murder, you probably wouldn't keep them employed. So the long-term goal of creating a culture where that's just not acceptable and companies are under pressure to hire and maintain people with ethical values. What else? I talked about the blacklist. Case management strategies. So we were, I spoke about collecting all the evidence, but also we spoke about aligning with international NGOs and having sister partnerships and relationships, and also information sharing. Sometimes NGOs can be a little territorial or competitive. So it's important to, this is exactly a right step of, it's a multidisciplinary meeting, people coming from different fields and collaborating, information sharing. Again, international NGOs can help raise awareness, put the pressure that's needed. And let's see, what else? Talked about the pressure. Right, and again, it's just important that even though paperwork might be a little bit tedious, to really collect all forms of evidence, whether and to have watertight paperwork, whether it's video, audio, written, because it'll prove invaluable in compiling a huge case that can be used for advocacy and again, changing a whole culture. And lastly, case officers should be trained adequately. And again, one of the panelists mentioned how, I think it's Latifa, mentioned how you want to use the word, what is the word? Just like, when you're filing a case that starts with a T, I'm just totally... Trafficking. Yes, of course. You want to use that because the paperwork will deem it watertight. And so the police need to be better trained, case officers. We had a member of a group talking about maybe further learning about international refugee laws, and all these things prove very helpful to tackle it holistically. So, but basically, just quickly, I think the most important question was the resolution just? So yes, it's a good start, but there's much more that we can do. Whether it's financially is one thing, but criminally, legally, psychologically. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's a good step. questions? No? Okay.
Who's group number 2?